Hi, my name's Jacob, and I'm going to be presenting today for my final presentation on Carl Beam and his form of indigenous expressive art. So first, as pictured, you can see Carl Beam, and he was alive from 1943 to 2005, and he was born on the Michigan Nation on Manitou Island, which is in Canada. His mother, Barbara, is Ojibwe. Both of her parents were Ojibwe. And his father, Edward, was a U.S. soldier who was fully American, who served in World War II, and he actually died as a prisoner of war after being captured. Carl was forced to attend a school that was meant to convert American Indians into more contemporary Western values. And at this school, him, along with many classmates, sustained a lot of abuse, particularly from the teachers. And so eventually Beam dropped out of class. We fast forward to a few years, and Carl found a passion for painting in 1960, and this led him to studying literature and having ceramic classes at the University of Victoria in Canada. And this profound love for art really took off. And he kind of came to this idea that he wanted his art to confront racism, stereotypes, and the iron holds of colonialism that had so long gripped indigenous art and just indigenous societies collectively. So the piece of art that I'll be focusing on today is called Self-Portrait in My Christian Dior Bathing Suit from 1980, as pictured to the right. It's a 1980 watercolor painting, and as we know, at this time, there are hardly any indigenous artists, especially in Canada, who practiced contemporary art. It was quite rare. But one exception was Manitoulin Island. And here we had a collection of Ojibwe artists who practiced what was called Anishinaabe art style. And their art typically consisted of these symbolic figures, animals, and spirits, a lot of things that we would see with stereotypical indigenous art. Because that is what people wanted to see. They wanted to see the romanticized Native American societies. And Beam respected this form of art, but saw its flaws. Anishinaabe art, was inadvertently contributing to these false narratives of indigenous people. It promoted narratives of them being huntsmen, of this profound spirituality, and just people who are dissimilar to the common man, which is what made them so interesting. So Beam, with his art, he wanted to adapt contemporary styles and techniques. His favorite form of art was collages. He utilized collages as he wanted to essentially force the viewer and really analyze the meaning of his art. He describes his art as meaning to convey semiotics, which semiotics is the expression of open meaning. That is what his art was meant to utilize, was to force the viewer to, again, analyze and really think about what is trying to be portrayed. His usage of watercolor in 1980 for indigenous art, it essentially distanced himself from, for example, those Ojibwe artists on Manitoulin Island. So let's break it down. After looking at his art, we are going to be looking at context and function. So context. It's actually a self-portrait of Carl Beam, and he is posing what looks to be like a confident model that we would see in a magazine advertisement. And there's some lettering to the left of the image to show this as well. Again, as stated before, this is a watercolor painting, and that was more contemporary than traditional indigenous works. A lot of the times they involved pastels or crayon, and were on parchment. What's also contemporary is Beam is partially naked. He's down to his underwear. He has this thick, groomed black hair and this messy beard. And he looks noble, but yet savage in a modern context. And so what function does this serve? As we know, Indians and other Native American peoples love invoking a sense of humor into their expressionisms. And I think that's just also kind of a coping mechanism for all the prejudice and stereotypes they have faced. This piece of art, you could say, also demonstrates inclusion of Native people in the fashion industry, of which they are never shown in. Which in turn, is showing that we are here and we are in the jobs that you wouldn't think we would be in. So it's subverting the preconceived notions of savagery. A lot of indigenous art shows savagery in forest and woodland settings. And this one shows kind of a savage, unkept man who is modern and it is in a modern setting. And without context, if I had not said all this stuff, you, the viewer, probably would never have known that this is a Native American man. And the overall overarching function is that it is portraying what we call true Indian versus this concept of a romanticized Indian that we have talked about all of class. So, lastly, and most importantly, how does this connect to these themes that we've been discussing for so long? And I'm going to examine 4. And they all similarly tie together. So when looking at cultural identity, again, we see Beam. He is shown wearing this Dior swimsuit. Now, Dior is this expensive Western fashion brand, not indigenous. But in doing so, Beam is demonstrating that Native Americans do live in the modern world and are allowed to define themselves how they see fit. They want to establish their own cultural identity. And this demonstrates, that Native Americans will not be subjugated or forced into modern invisibility and these romanticized identities that they've so long been attributed with. And it also demonstrates autonomy. It is showing that Native American people are people that can make their own decisions, can demonstrate who they want to be and how they want to show that, and in doing so shows a modern cultural identity. It also addresses stereotypes, and all of these kind of play in together, but it demonstrates what a true Native man can look like, and it denounces the stereotypical garb and, the props such as the hatchets and the feathered hats that were commonly used and worn, for example, in the Curtis photographs, in which those Native American people were culturally appropriated for Curtis's gain. And this is doing the opposite of that entirely. And it demonstrates resistance and colonialism. So as repeated and as the viewer could see, this goes against this traditional, almost what I would say flawed Native art that we have grown accustomed to. I would say it's flawed because it is false of what Native life and Native people actually are. And it does this, it demonstrates what indigenous art it actually is and what it can be by showing this authentic representation. And in doing so, it undermines the colonialist efforts that have been a plague, and it forces viewers to analyze what an authentic Indian is. It's quite profound in its ability to, like I said, once you have context and you realize this is a Native American man, it's kind of eye-opening because this is not a portrayal we would typically see. Lastly, here are works cited. Anang Beam was primarily used, and she is Carl Beam's daughter and has fantastically created a biography of Carl that is worth reading, and I encourage you guys to look at it. Thank you.